It's a sentence that would have seemed impossible as late as the 23rd of February 2022, an outcome so remarkable we can't say it without knocking on wood. But here goes. It's starting to look like Russia might actually lose the Ukraine war. And not just lose badly. While nothing is certain, it's not inconceivable that Ukraine will roll Putin's troops back to their pre-invasion lines, that they might roll them out of Donbass, or whisper it, even out of Crimea. It would be a spectacular ending to a bitter, brutal war, a spark of hope in a year of darkness. Yet it also raises an uncomfortable question, one we may have to soon get used to asking. If Russia is defeated, what the hell happens next? And we don't just mean in Ukraine or within NATO or even to Vladimir Putin. We don't even mean to Russian society itself. We mean to the entire Russian sphere, to the countries and places on the Russian Federation's periphery. Countries that, until now, have lived, often unwillingly, with Moscow as their regional policeman. Countries that, if or when Russia falls, may be the site of a new wave of conflicts. Across history, there have been periods of time where peace becomes the norm, when the dominant local power becomes so powerful that it's able to police everyone else's behavior. In antiquity, this famously included the Pax Romana, the 200-year period when Rome was at its zenith and life was broadly stable and peaceful. We say broadly because there's obviously no such thing as an era where everything's calm. Even during these 2 centuries, the Romans faced their share of crises. But the key point is that stability held more often than it didn't. And that's true of other historical eras that we now refer to this way. The Pax Mongolica, following the Mongol conquest, or Pax Americana, when the US became the world's superpower. Yet one similar era may be now limping to its bitter end. Pax Russica is sometimes used to refer to the relative stability surrounding the Russian Federation, with Moscow playing the role of self-appointed lawman in the Caucasus and Central Asia. But if Russia is the sheriff, then the Ukraine war has shown him to be a drunken and incompetent boob. With hundreds of thousands of troops committed and tens of thousands dead or injured, this sheriff's authority is bleeding away fast. And that threatens to have a knock-on effect across the region. As analysts Chatham House noted, the security system across the former Soviet space does seem to be broken. Now, you might intuitively think that the collapse of a Russian-led order would be a good thing, that plenty of Moscow's neighbors are secretly praying for a Ukrainian victory. Whether that's true or not, though, it doesn't change the fact that a defeat for Putin wouldn't result only in non-stop parties. It'd also result in war, in conflicts, bloodshed on a scale not seen in a generation since the last time a regional empire collapsed, an empire known as the Soviet Union. At the time of its implosion in 1991, the USSR had evolved into an insanely complicated structure, a patchwork of nationalities and statelets so convoluted it could almost rival the Marvel multiverse. At its heart were the 15 first-level republics, places like Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Estonia or Russia that all became independent countries after 1991. But these were only the most obvious divides. Below the first-level republics also came a lot of second-level republics, the ASSRs, each of which had its own identity and rights, but lesser recognition. Below them came the autonomous regions and then the autonomous oblasts, each one in some way representing a distinct ethnicity or culture, usually inherited from the old Russian Empire. And it wasn't just Russia itself that was home to a swirl of peoples, but most of the first-level republics. To take just one example, the Georgian SSR was one of 15 main republics in the USSR, today the country of Georgia. But it was also home to the second-level Abkhaz and Adjarian ASSRs, plus the autonomous oblast of South Ossetia. As long as the USSR stayed intact, these distinctions weren't a big deal. When the center collapsed, though, they became immediate flashpoints. As the 15 first-level republics became independent nations, some of the second-level republics within their borders began wondering why they weren't likewise able to split, why they were stuck being a part of independent Georgia or Tajikistan and couldn't declare their own sovereignty. It didn't help that the designation of the first or second-level republic had often been arbitrary. Karelia, for example, spent 16 years as a full SSR before being booted down a rung. So some of the ASSRs decided to fight for their independence. The result was the helter-skelter of bloodshed that history now calls the post-Soviet conflicts, a set of wars made worse by the USSR's arbitrary borders. While each republic theoretically held one nationality or culture, Moscow often deliberately mixed things around the edges to dilute their power, meaning when things did fall apart, a whole bunch of former SSRs and ASSRs began fighting over various border regions. Famously, this included the two Chechen Wars, where the former Second-Level Republic fought for its freedom, got it, and then was forcibly reincorporated into Russia under Vladimir Putin. But it also included stuff like the Georgian Civil War, when the autonomous region of Abkhazia and South Ossetia tried to break off, or the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, which saw an autonomous oblast in now independent Azerbaijan fight to join independent Armenia. For a time, these wars and others that we don't have time to mention painted the lands of the ex-Soviet Union red with blood. But only for a time. Because there would soon be another policeman stepping up to take the USSR's place, a successor nation determined to impose its own peace. And of course, we're talking about the Russian Federation. Although plenty of Western capitals had cheered the collapse of the USSR, they were less excited by the instability that sprang up in its wake. So when Moscow started to reassert itself in its backyard, it received remarkably little pushback, despite some questionable methods. Most questionable was, of course, bombing Chechnya back to the Stone Age and then forcing it to rejoin Russia under a local strongman named Kadyrov. It's his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, who still rules the region today. More common, though, was the permanent deployment of Russian peacekeepers to hotspots. Peacekeepers who ensured wars didn't flare back up, but also kept old first-level republics stuck in Moscow's orbit. This was how Moldova's Transnistrian War ended, how Georgia's civil war concluded, how the First Nagorno-Karabakh War was quietened. In each case, the conflict became frozen, meaning there was no lasting peace, no resolution of the underlying issues, just a whole bunch of Russians with guns enforcing a ceasefire. This is why the issue of a Russian collapse is so worrying today. The arguments that started these wars are still unresolved, still ready to flare back up the moment the peacekeepers are gone. Recognizing this, Moscow tried in the early 2000s to introduce an extra layer of security across the region, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Building on a defense pact that many ex-Soviet nations signed in the 1990s, the CSTO brought together Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, with Uzbekistan briefly joining in 2006 before exiting in 2012. Like NATO, the CSTO treaty had an article, in this case, Article 4, that stipulated an attack on one was an attack on all. Like NATO, it also wasn't afraid to flex its muscles from time to time. Although it was mostly a Russian affair, the CSTO contributed to propping up Assad's regime in the Syrian civil war, with Armenia supplying troops for demining operations. More high profile was the organization's intervention in member state Kazakhstan in January 2022, which saw a combined force put down mass protests that threatened the government. In short, the CSTO became a cornerstone of the Pax Russica, a forum for Moscow to wield its power over its near abroad. Combined with all those Russian peacekeepers deployed to hotspots, it briefly seemed to work. When former first-level republics Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan clashed along their poorly demarcated border in 2021, Moscow was part of the delegation, forcing them to turn down the heat. Things were less successful during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War, which saw Azerbaijan and Armenia's frozen conflict re-erupt into 6 weeks of bloodshed. Yet, even in this case, Russia was a key part of the ceasefire. They deployed 2,000 peacekeepers to patrol contested areas to stop a repeat. In this way, Vladimir Putin was able to play the regional policeman, the security guarantor, stopping a return to the post-Soviet conflicts of the 1990s. Of course, it was a self-serving piece, as Georgia found out in 2008 when Russia invaded, as Kyiv found out in 2014 when Putin snatched Crimea and fomented an uprising in the Donbass. The key point, though, is that the peace broadly held, that with Russia boasting what was then called the world's second greatest army, the frozen post-Soviet conflicts remained frozen. And then came the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Although the exact numbers are disputed, it's thought Moscow has sustained tens of thousands of casualties in the catastrophic war. That's led to scores of Russian peacekeeping troops being withdrawn to shore up its badly mauled army, an army that has seen its fearsome reputation torn to shreds. No longer Dirty Harry, the regional policeman now looks more like one of the Keystone Cops, a figure to be pitied rather than respected. Which brings us back to the question from our introduction. What the hell happens next? What does everyone do when they realize the scary policeman is really just a pushover? Worryingly, we're already beginning to find out. There's a famous Hemingway quote about bankruptcy that often gets applied to wartime defeats, that these things happen slowly, then all at once. Right now, we're in the slowly part of things. While Russia has certainly been weakened on the battlefield, it hasn't yet lost the war, nor has its military totally collapsed. But things are certainly trending in that direction, and if we want to discuss what future wars might break out following a Russian loss, it's instructive to look at what's happening now, before the all-at-once part kicks in. And what's happening now is a flare-up of unrest on Russia's borders. The first incident took place in the earlier days of the war, when Russia had been humiliated around Kiev, but hadn't yet suffered any shock losses of conquered territory. In the separatist Transnistria region in Moldova, a series of mysterious explosions shook the biggest cities, destroying transmitters, damaging airports, and in one major incident, resulting in a rocket-propelled grenade hitting the headquarters of the security services. The attacks killed no one, causing only property damage, but the important part is that they took place in a frozen conflict zone, one of the regions of the former USSR where Russia had deployed peacekeepers. Now, we still don't know what the motive was, or if it's even fair to put these attacks in the same category as other eruptions of violence. Plenty still think this was a failed attempt by the Kremlin to drag Moldova into the war. But while the nature of this incident remains up for grabs, the same can't be said of another. Taking place just as the Russian front in Kharkiv was collapsing, renewed fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia was exactly what we'd expect to see if the era of Pax Russica had ended. On September 12, 2022, deadly fighting exploded around Nagorno-Karabakh, the site of the 6-week war 2 years earlier. This time around, the violence was less intense, only 280 people died, and a new ceasefire was in place after only 2 days. Importantly, though, this latest eruption saw some significant operational shifts, including Azerbaijan shelling Armenian towns outside the disputed areas, including, too, a failure by Russia to stop the violence. And this is notable because Armenia, unlike Azerbaijan, is a member of the CSTO, and Armenia invoked Article 4, the Collective Defense Pact. But rather than go in all guns blazing, the CSTO merely agreed to send a fact-finding mission. So distracted in Ukraine, Moscow was unable to fulfill its role as Armenia's security guarantee. Analysts have since suggested that the clashes were Azerbaijan's way of testing Russia's commitment to the CSTO. If so, Baku got exactly what it wanted: confirmation that Moscow is unwilling to intervene on Armenia's behalf, especially while Azerbaijan is backed by Turkey, a major buyer of Russian exports. As a result, Armenia is now talking about leaving the CSTO. Embarrassing as this was for Russia's forced projection, though, it's what came next that really damaged Putin's reputation. On September 14th, the day Armenia and Azerbaijan concluded a ceasefire, border clashes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan exploded. For decades, the region has been home to sporadic violence between local communities, thanks in large part to the USSR never bothering to properly demarcate the border between these two first-level republics. The 2022 violence was different, though. Rather than just border guards, the clash saw tanks get involved, helicopters, heavy artillery, drones. In the exchange of fire, villages were leveled, hundreds were killed, 140,000 civilians fled. The wildest part is that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are both members of the CSTO, and just as with Armenia, the organization failed to do anything. Notable too was the timing. The clashes erupted just as Putin was visiting neighboring Uzbekistan to meet with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Less than a year ago, spoiling Putin's big day like that would have been unthinkable. As unthinkable as the Kyrgyzstani leader keeping Putin waiting at a summit, something which likewise happened. But that's what the end of an empire entails. Up becomes down, black becomes white. Then one day, all of a sudden, you find yourself no longer the emperor rocking his shiny new clothes, but the naked Tsar, squirming beneath the crowd's mocking gaze. So that's where things stand at the time of this recording, at an inflection point, with multiple paths leading to multiple possible futures. One's not so bad for Putin, involving him slowly regaining the upper hand in Ukraine, negotiating a ceasefire his hardliners can live with, and concentrating on rebuilding his forces and regional dominance. One is cataclysmic for Russia, but not so for its neighbors, a path leading to a future where Putin's army is shattered in Ukraine, but other regional players like China and Turkey step in and become the new policemen. But it's the final path that we're concerned with today. The dark path where the policeman is gone, but no one arrives in Central Asia or the Caucasus to take his place. The path that leads to an unstable new world, one forged in the fires of war. So, here it is. The part where we finally take a look at some of the future wars that could erupt if Russia's military suffers a complete collapse. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball. All this is just based on currently available information and what experts and analysts are saying. It could be that everything you're about to see is wrong, and this video dates really badly. That being said, there are some hotspots where we'd be amazed if there aren't future flare-ups. Perhaps the hottest of them all being the Nagorno-Karabakh region between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The 2020 war saw Azeri forces retake much of the former autonomous oblast that Armenian troops had held since the 1990s. But there still remains disputed territory Azerbaijan is open about wanting to grab. What makes this the most likely flashpoint isn't just the unfinished business angle, it's also the visible weakening of Russian power on the ground. Way back in spring, Moscow began withdrawing its peacekeepers from the region to help plug holes in its badly mauled Ukrainian invasion force. Already, something like half of the peacekeeping troops deployed there have gone, and the 2 days of fighting this September have already shown that CSTO is unwilling to help Armenia. With its forces backed by Turkey, Azerbaijan has probably concluded that the contested territory is now up for grabs. Although Armenia has been making overtures to the US and the EU, it's hard to see either stepping into the regional policeman role in time if Russia is defeated. Nor is this the only potential hotspot in the Caucasus. Lower down the probability list, but certainly not impossible, is the disputed South Ossetia region in Georgia. Another autonomous oblast from the days of the USSR, South Ossetia was a key battleground in the Georgian Civil War, as well as the stated reason for Russia's 2008 invasion of Georgia. Since then, it's been de facto under Russian occupation, and the local leadership has repeatedly threatened to take things further. In the early days of the Ukraine war, South Ossetia's president announced a referendum on joining Russia, a prelude to annexation. While the idea was dropped before summer, it caused a backlash in Georgia. A video of Georgian men claiming to be fighting in Ukraine's international brigades went viral, calling for South Ossetia to be recaptured while Moscow is distracted. In short, it's another region that perfectly combines a deadly mix of elevated tensions and unfinished business. However, South Ossetia is not Nagorno-Karabakh, and Georgia is not Azerbaijan. For one thing, the local ruling party, Georgian Dream, is seen as relatively pro-Kremlin. For another, polls show a consistent supermajority of citizens want to resolve the South Ossetia issue through negotiation rather than force. That means a future war erupting here or over Georgia's other disputed territory of Abkhazia is lower in likelihood. Still, it's a region that will be worth mentioning. Back up the probability ladder, we have another eruption between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. The long-lasting issue here is the Fergana Valley, a vitally important source of water and pasture land for frontier dwellers in both nations, plus Uzbekistan. In Soviet times, the valley was divided haphazardly between them, meaning all three currently have just enough to place a claim on it, but not enough to ensure that their citizens have enough access to the lands and rivers that they desperately need. Again, this was an area once rife with Russian peacekeepers, but at least 1,500 have since been withdrawn to fight in Ukraine. More troubling from Kyrgyzstan's perspective is that Putin seems to be getting closer and closer to Tajikistan's dictator. If Bishkek believes that policemen can't be relied upon to be impartial, then the chances of finding a peaceful solution become increasingly remote. In a worrying sign that they fully expect the fighting to erupt again, both nations have refused a CTSO offer to mediate. These, then, are the regions in the former Soviet world where we'd most expect new wars to erupt or old wars to reignite, should Ukraine win a total victory. And this isn't even including places like Syria and parts of North Africa, where Moscow is helping prop up fragile governments. But rather than examine all the regions around the world where Russian troops operate, we now want to turn to perhaps the darkest and messiest outcome of all. A possibility that remains remote, but does need to be taken seriously. The possibility that the Russian state itself could disintegrate. In the 1990s, nothing caused anywhere near as much bloodshed in Europe as the collapse of Yugoslavia. For decades a successful multi-ethnic state, it wound up tearing itself apart into 7 independent countries via a series of wars that killed 140,000 people. For observers at the time, the bloodletting was all the more shocking for being so unexpected. Less than a decade earlier, Sarajevo had hosted the Winter Olympics and seemed a model of integration, and now the city was back in the news again, at the heart of a maelstrom of sectarian violence. Now, of course, modern Russia is not Yugoslavia in the 90s. It's a far more centralized state, and Putin has a much firmer grip on power than the post-Tito Yugoslav leaders ever did. Nonetheless, there are parallels. Perhaps the most important being that the Russian Federation is likewise a multi-ethnic state in which one ethnicity is dominating all others. Despite officially being a federation of different peoples, 22% of the population are claimed to be non-Russian, modern Russia has increasingly become more and more centralized and more ethno-nationalist. By that, we mean that non-Russians from the Federation's republics routinely face discrimination, both overtly and in the form of a steady chipping away at their cultures, languages, right to self-government, and identity. Most visibly, this came in 2017, when Putin suddenly announced a new law that forbid the republics to require the teaching of their local languages, replacing them instead with mandatory Russian courses. But the war has accelerated what was already evident in Russian society. From the initial invasion onwards, the makeup of those fighting and dying in Ukraine has been heavily tilted toward the minority republics, particularly those with Asian ethnicities. Partially, that's because more young men join the military in those places. With very few economic opportunities, the army is often the only way out of poverty. Yet, the divide only increased when Putin announced his partial mobilization. While it really was a partial mobilization in most ethnically Russian regions, in minority republics, it often looked like a total mobilization. As the Institute for the Study of War put it, the Kremlin has a continued policy of using poor and minority communities to bear the brunt of forced generation efforts while protecting ethnic Russians and wealthier Russian citizens. Others, like Oxford University's Dr. Samuel Romani, have suggested that mobilization in some communities has even constituted ethnic cleansing, all of which is a long way of saying that there are resentments currently building in the Russian Federation that go beyond a simple divide between nationalist hardliners and war realists, resentments that come with an identity component that could explode if the center collapses. To see different ways how that might play out, let's look at two specific independent-minded republics, Tatarstan and Chechnya. A Muslim-majority republic, Tatarstan has been one of the regions most directly in the firing line of Putin's growing ethno-nationalism. In 1994, with the First Chechen War looming, it was granted significant powers of autonomy and taxation, powers that the Kremlin has now been chipping away at for decades. At one point, the Tatars even organized referendum, which led to 61.4% of the population voting to become a sovereign state. But apparently, the Kremlin only likes referendums when they take place in other countries. The results were ignored by Moscow, as was a 2008 declaration of independence by Tatarstan, which appealed to the UN for recognition. So, Tatarstan has the history and determination to attempt to break off from Russia should Putin's hold on power slip. It also has huge energy reserves that could make it a viable independent state. For this reason, it could be one to watch in case of a broader Russian disintegration. Surprisingly, because Chechnya's strongman ruler Ramzan Kadyrov is considered a Putin loyalist. Surprisingly too, because there are hints that he might want the top job should Putin fall. But his sheer unpopularity with the Russian elite might make a Kadyrov presidency impossible. Much easier for him is to retreat to Chechnya, a long run as his personal fiefdom, and declare independence from whatever new central authority emerges in Moscow. Especially if that new authority is weak, Kadyrov may see that as his best way to ensure his own continued power and indeed survival. In many ways, though, such a clean split might be the least of anyone's worries. In the extreme hypothetical scenario where the Russian Federation collapses, the bloodshed could far surpass anything seen in the 1990s. Like the Soviet Union, this is a nation with layers upon layers of autonomous republics, regions, and oblasts, each with possible claims to be independent states, each with potentially messy borders. The result, then, could be a wave of violence, of ethnic cleansing, of refugees fleeing on a scale that would dwarf even the Ukraine war. Add in the spectre of nuclear proliferation, and you can begin to see why this might be a worrying outcome. At the end of all that, then, we're left with not a single answer to our original question, what happens next, but multiple versions of the future. Some horrifying, some catastrophic. That's not to say Ukraine doesn't deserve to win. We've got our fingers crossed as much as anyone in the hope that they can kick Russia out and restore their stolen territory. But we do need to simultaneously think about what that might mean, what it might mean if an empire dies today in the 21st century. As the Harvard historian Serhiy Plokhy wrote in his 2014 book, The Last Empire, on the end of the USSR, the collapse of the Soviet Union is far from over. The last empire continues its convulsions. Should Russia be catastrophically defeated in Ukraine, it could be that those convulsions continue to shape our world for a very long time to come.